recent street cred with the administration. And I, as Mr. Congressman, from what I consider to be of interest.
Well, thank you everyone for coming on out today. Today we have a very special speaker event planned for you. Dr. Robert Lieber from Georgetown University. I'll be having Will over here introduce the professor real quick, and our moderator for the day, Professor John Chochari. And we'll be moving on, very quick speakers' remarks, followed by a question and answer session from the audience. I'm very excited to have you guys on today, and hope this will be fun and informative. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for showing up to this event. So this event is hosted by the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization, part of a national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch students and young men and women into foreign policy and national security careers imbued with a Hamiltonian perspective of strong principled American leadership in global affairs. This event is featured by, moderated by Professor John B. Chochari, who is the Associate Professor of Public Policy and Director of the International Policy Center and the Wiser Diplomacy Center. And then, of course, we have Dr. Robert Lieber, who's a Professor of Government and International Affairs at Georgetown University, where he has previously served as the Chair of the Government Department and the Interim Chair of Psychology. He's the author and editor of 17 books on international relations, advisor to presidential campaigns, to the State Department, and to the drafters of the U.S. National Intelligence Estimates. So we welcome, of course, Dr. Lieber as well as Dr. Chochari for being here with us today. So yeah, I'll leave the floor up to Dr. Chochari.
Thank you. Well, we want to thank you for coming and thank you to Professor Lieber for joining us. Will has already offered an introduction to Professor Lieber's impressive career. Let me just say a few things on top of that, which is that much of his work, especially much of his recent work, has concerned the theme of tonight's talk on primacy versus restraint in U.S. grand strategy. He's very well known both in academic and policy circles as an analyst of big questions in U.S. foreign policy and international politics, not least among those questions, the appropriate scale and sort of role that the United States should play in global affairs. He's been at the center of discussions and debates on whether the United States is a country in decline or whether we should look at the United States as a country that's resilient and has much to look forward to in terms of both its ability to defend its and advance its values as well as its interests. He's also been very much at the forefront of policy conversations on whether, when, and how the United States should re-engage internationally or pursue a policy of retrenchment. And it couldn't be more relevant than the period when we're witnessing the aftermath of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, as well as the conversation about when and how for the United States to adjust its response to the Far East. So, Professor Lieber, welcome to the University of Michigan. We look forward to your remarks and a good discussion with the AHS.
Thank you very much. I think I will switch to the podium. Is that microphone hot? Is it live?
That's fine.
It's up, okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I mentioned that I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, and of course we used to play Michigan in football every year. That's a separate topic. I have a lot of friends who went here. I visited several times, and I think I have a pretty good idea about Michigan. I also like the fact of first-rate, intellectually serious and high-quality public supported higher education. Wisconsin, Michigan, for instance, embody that as well and better than any other institutions in the country. Let me turn though to the subject of my talk. The title is Primacy and Restraint, U.S. Grand Strategy, in U.S. Grand Strategy. And I'd like to suggest to you that the title sets up a very misleading dichotomy. That is to say, on the one hand, the word restraint refers to the views of realist scholars and policy advocates. Barry Posen of MIT wrote a book entitled Restraint that was published in 2014. And others among realist thinkers, libertarians, and others, progressives sometimes, adopt the position referred to as restraint. Restraint is a diplomatic word for what is really neo-isolationism. It's a position that I think is untenable, very misleading, and has potentially serious adverse consequences, not only for the United States, but for international order, if followed out to its logical conclusion. So it's true that part of the title for this session can be restraint, but the other part of the title, primacy, I think sets up a straw horse or a straw man. Primacy is misleading in the sense that it implies the alternative is that America has to be the world's policeman, that it be the dominant or hegemonic power in the world, the unipolar power, but it's not really an effective analytical device, to use that phrase, nor is it accurate normatively and descriptively. The U.S. did have that kind of power at one point. After the collapse of the Soviet Union at Christmas Day 1991, and perhaps until September 11th, 2001, with the attack on New York and Washington. It was a period of a decade that Charles Krauthammer referred to as the holiday from history. The circumstances were unique, but they no longer exist and haven't existed for some time. There are claims by the leading thinkers of restraint. One thinks, of course, here of Barry Posen at MIT, John Mearsheimer at Chicago, Steve Walt at Harvard, most of whom I've debated over the years, whose ideas I'm familiar with, and with ideas which I think are mistaken. They argue, almost all of them, that U.S. policy since 1945, and especially since 1991, has been a policy to impose liberal hegemony or impose liberal democracy on the world. That is a fantasy. That's not the case. Whatever you think of the decisions to invade Afghanistan, which was a decision authorized by a vote of the Congress and by a vote in the United Nations and by NATO, or whether you think that it was wise or unwise to invade Iraq in 2003, a decision that the U.S. Congress approved, including Senators John Kerry and Joe Biden, for instance. The fact is the U.S. did not invade Afghanistan or Iraq with the principal mission of imposing democracy. The invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was to seek out and destroy Al-Qaeda, which was responsible for the attack on New York and Washington, the worst attack on the American homeland in its history. The war in Afghanistan was essentially because of concerns that Saddam Hussein was seeking to develop weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. That proved to be a mistake, but the notion that we invaded Iraq in order to impose democracy is simply not true. It was cited ex post facto, after the fact, particularly when it became clear that weapons of mass destruction in the form of nuclear program was not there, although it had been there 10 years earlier. But to somehow go back and say that's what has dominated American policy over the years is simply a mistake. So I suggest to you that the whole restraint notion and the realist approach to foreign policy is fatally flawed. It's the current advocate of those ideas is the currently an outfit called the Quincy Foundation. It's based in Washington, and it has support from opposite ends of the political spectrum, which should cause one to be, say, suspicious. It has funding from George Soros on the left and from the Koch brothers on the right, which is an interesting juxtaposition involving people from the progressive left, the realist, from the libertarian right, and from realists. So first, why is the restraint or realism approach unrealistic? Well, it wrongly assumes that the U.S. can retreat from the outside world, mind its own business, and be safe, secure, and prosperous. And to intervene only when our national security is dangerously threatened by a hegemonic power in Europe or Asia, if in circumstances where local authorities, local actors, other states cannot effectively balance against such a threat. So there's a tendency to want to pull back, let the world proceed without us. If there are going to be wars out there, let other people fight them. We want to opt out. But here it's worth invoking the name of Leon Trotsky. Some of you will recognize that Trotsky was one of three who made a revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, in October 1917. And Trotsky was famous for the phrase, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. For his credit, having created the Red Army and defeated the opposition whites in the Civil War, in the mid-1930s, he was assassinated by a Stalinist agent who buried an ice axe in his brain in Mexico, where he had fled from Stalin in the Soviet Union. What realism does is deprive hostile actors of agency. To bring that down to reality, it implies that countries that are adversarial toward the U.S., think of Xi Jinping's China, Putin and Russia, Iran of the mullahs, North Korea, and so on, are hostile toward us because of what we say or do. And if we would only be nice, things would change. In other words, Russia is angry with us because we enlarged NATO. Iran is angry with us because we had a minor role in the overthrow of the Shah, the overthrow of the Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953. A role, by the way, that's greatly exaggerated, and for which every president practically since Dwight Eisenhower has apologized. But this deprives these actors of agency. By that I mean that foreign leaders and foreign regimes have their own logic, their own path dependency, their own ideologies, their own regime interests, their own histories, which shape their policies. Of course, what we do and say matters, but it's not the predominant decisive factor. It's not why Xi Jinping is doing what he's doing. It's not why Putin, who runs a kleptocracy, does what he does. They have very strong internal reasons. Same thing with the mullahs in Iran. And to think that if only we change our policies, change our strategies, we no longer have to worry about hostility from those countries or them doing things that are threatening to our national interests, broadly defined, is the issue here. I think I said to Will that I would quote Hans Morgenthau at one point. I did 1 year of graduate study at the University of Chicago after finishing my BA at Wisconsin, before going on to complete the doctorate at Harvard. And I took everything Hans Morgenthau taught. And Morgenthau was fond of a phrase about strategic narcissism. It's a phrase which General H.R. McMaster has revived in making a similar point recently in his own writing. The idea of strategic narcissism is that the rest of the world essentially dances to what we say and do, to what our strategy is. And that's what shapes their behavior, rather than giving them credit for their own agency, their own priorities, and so forth. Of course, there's interaction here. But you have to also look at the essence of these regimes to understand what motivates them. And it's a mistake to assume that the adversarial views of foreign countries are a reaction to what we're all about. You also have to look at the historical record. In the 20th century, there were several occasions in which American leaders, the Congress, the American public, preferred to try to stay out. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the argument that he kept us out of war. But in April 1917, Wilson finally led the U.S. intervening for fear that Imperial Germany would come to dominate, win the war, hostile to the United States, would come to dominate the European continent in ways that would be dangerous to the United States, its values and interests. In the 1930s, I should say after World War I, there was a reaction against the war. The war to end all wars, the war to achieve Wilson's 14 points, had failed to bring these utopian outcomes. And as fascism, the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and the fascist generals in Japan took place, the U.S. tried to stay out of it. To the extent that war broke out in Europe on September 1st, 1939. It had been waged in the Far East earlier than that, as Japan ran wild in parts of China and East Asia. Finally, with Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the U.S. entered World War II. 2 years and nearly 3 months after the rest of Europe had been at war. The intervention was unavoidable. Japan had attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, and after the U.S. declared war on Japan, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. But America's most vital interests were at stake: our way of life, our values, our security, and those of a decent, rule-based world. And finally, even with the Cold War, at the end of World War II, until April 1945, when he died suddenly, President Franklin Roosevelt and his administration, including his immediate successor, Harry Truman, assumed that we would start by being on good terms with our Soviet ally. The Soviets had lost as many as 27 million dead in the war. They had done the majority of the fighting in Europe. And the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States were the three superpowers of the day that together had defeated Nazi Germany, with the US and the Brits defeating Japan in the Pacific. So the assumption was that we would get along with the Russians, that the Brits would basically be the dominant player in Western Europe, and the US could disengage. The US had 16 million American men and 750,000 American women under arms at one point or another during World War II. And with the end of the war, there was a massive demobilization of the armed forces. But by early 1947, by February 1947, it became clear that there was no way of avoiding the Cold War because of the actions of Stalin and the Soviet Union. And so once more, rather than risk a major power, hostile hegemon, coming to dominate the Eurasian landmass, earlier Imperial Germany, World War I, Hitler, World War II, Soviets, Cold War, the US was drawn back in. You can't sit it out even if you would like to. Now what about the American role? Keep in mind that the US has a unique role to play. It's not all bombs and guns. It's about leadership, engagement, and indispensability. Strategically, the US presence is unique in bringing, for our European and Asian allies, deterrence, defense, and reassurance. Deterrence in the sense of discouraging adversaries from attacking or trying to dominate entire regions. Defense in helping others with the United States, in creating the capacity to resist if attacked, and reassurance, above all, a psychological measure, to convince our allies and others that we've got their back. And for that reassurance, it has to be tangible. You can't just say it, you have to be tangible signs. In the Cold War, although we didn't want to fight a war in Europe, at the end of the Cold War, we had about 325,000 troops, US troops in Europe, on the European continent, along with about an equal number of dependents. That signaled to the Soviets that were they to invade, and they certainly had the conventional military capacity to do so, the fact that there being so many Americans there meant that de facto they would find themselves at war with the United States, regardless of what a president might say or not say. So it was part of the reassurance of the Europeans. So the American role in that sense is critical. There's also, for those of you involved in public policy and familiar with collective action problems, there's also the issue of collective action and collective action dilemmas. It's hard for a group of people or a group of states to agree on a shared course of action, particularly for lesser powers. To have the US engaged with NATO is critically important. If you are Belgium or Italy, or even France or Germany, do you want to be out front in confronting the Soviet Union during the Cold War? Or do you fear abandonment in case the others fall away? Well, the presence of US troops during the Cold War, the existence of NATO and the American role, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which says that an attack on one NATO member country is an attack on all, was critical to this sense of collective action, that the U.S. would be there. And so this is a role that only the U.S. can play. The European Union on paper looks fabulous. Almost 500 million people, enormous economic strength, a regulatory power, but they do not exist as a strategic and foreign policy power because the life and death decisions about the use of force, the military, grand strategy, and so forth remain at the national level. Which is why the U.S. role, again, is absolutely critical. Now, let me turn more to the U.S. participation, U.S. strategy. I'm writing a book right now, which will be out next year, published by Yale University Press. The title is Indispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in a Turbulent World. In the book, I ask three questions. Is a U.S. role of active engagement in world affairs still indispensable for a decent, rules-based world order? My answer is yes. Second question, does the U.S. still have the capacity to play such a role that it has played in the past at a time when it faces the rise of hostile revisionist powers? China especially, but also Russia, Iran, North Korea, others. My answer is that we have the material strengths to do that, although somewhat diminished, but still the material strengths to play that role. But that on the ideational policy side, there are huge question marks about American politics, political polarization, society, and culture. It can't be ruled out, but it remains in question. The third question then is, if the U.S. can't play that indispensable role, what are the likely consequences? My answer is, if we don't play that role, the consequences are likely to be a much nastier, less prosperous, less democratic, less human rights regarding, more unequal, more violent, more disorderly, more war-prone international relations. And in an environment which would not only be harmful to others, but harmful to our own interests and national security. The term indispensability was first used, by the way, in this context by Bill Clinton in his second inaugural on January 20th, 1997. I'll note that even Barack Obama, who sought to retreat or pull back, by the end of his presidency acknowledged that the U.S. role in world affairs really was indispensable. That not the United Nations, not the EU, not the French or British or Germans or Japanese or Indians could play the role the U.S. did. No one else could. The U.S. role, though, requires selectivity, allies, the combination of diplomacy with strength. Power and diplomacy go together. Kofi Annan, as Secretary General of the UN, once said, diplomacy can do many things, but diplomacy backed by power can do many more things. It has been said that power without diplomacy is blind, but diplomacy without power is impotent. The combination of the two is extraordinary, but each by itself is inadequate. So you need to combine power and diplomacy, good judgment, allies, military capacity, economic strength, soft power, technology, and so forth to be effective. We have the capacity to do that, but it's not automatic. Let me wrap up. There's no free lunch. The restrainers assume there is a free lunch, but there's not. Leadership abroad has costs, but failing to act also has costs, especially when national interests, security, and Western values are at stake. Exhibit A for realist authors and critics of U.S. foreign policy has been the rise of Russian hostility toward the U.S., the EU, and the West, allegedly triggered by an ill-advised NATO enlargement that absorbed former members of the Russian-dominated Warsaw Pact, as well as the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been forcibly integrated into the Soviet Union by Stalin. But a recent study by two scholars, one Russian, one American, Andrei Shurstenov of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations and Bill Wohlforth of Dartmouth, reads it quite differently. That the root issue for Russia was not so much NATO enlargement, but the existence of NATO itself, rather than its expansion per se. They conclude that much of the debate about NATO expansion misconstrues its stakes and arguably exaggerates the likelihood that the fallout for U.S.-Russia relations could have been avoided. Moreover, the alternative of a strategy of restraint they had, in which NATO did not expand and the U.S. sought cooperation, would not have been reciprocated by Putin and his leadership. Instead, Russia would likely have asserted some form of primacy averse to America's interests. And to this analysis, you need to ask, what do the Europeans want? And the answer is the Europeans who joined NATO after the end of the Cold War, Eastern European countries, were scared out of their minds of the Russians. They'd lived next door to Russia. They'd experienced what its power and rapaciousness had meant to them. And they were desperate to get into NATO. And you have to factor that into this decision too. They viewed, think of the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, as well as the Baltic countries and others. They viewed the alliance as ensuring their autonomy and political freedom against any future Russian effort to reassert regional dominance. Look at Ukraine for an object lesson of what happens to those countries who aren't part of NATO in this context. And not only Russia, but China, Iran, even Turkey, in their revisionist behavior and their quest for regional dominance, are exercising their own agency. The histories, ideologies, and interests of those ruling regimes have a powerful life of their own and are not simply reactions to the policies and regional alignments of the United States. Finally, are there alternatives to the indispensable American role? Can somebody else do it, not us? It would be reassuring to think that international norms, rules, and institutions have become self-sustaining, and that the capabilities and self-interest of America's allies and those who benefit from that order are more than sufficient to maintain it. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The U.S. remains the necessary catalyst for international collaboration. The regional predations of Russia and Iran and the aggressive economic geopolitical behavior of China have met with a limited or inadequate response when left simply to their immediate neighbors. The assurance that realists give us that while other countries will balance against predatory hegemons is in fact inaccurate. Much more common is bandwagoning, whereas weaker neighbors like the Philippines, even though pressed upon, throw in their lot with the guys who are oppressing them rather than risk their wrath by opposing them if they're not backed by the United States. In real-world collective action problems, allies mostly remain reluctant or unable to act effectively absent America's role in galvanizing cooperation. Realist assurances about counterbalancing against regional hegemons have proved empty. For the United States, then, the situation does not present a false dichotomy of all or nothing, of endless military intervention or de facto abdication. Instead, it highlights the importance of skilled diplomacy, skilled leadership, with prudence in choosing when and where to engage, and the need to combine national power with diplomacy. But while it's important to avoid overcommitment abroad, it's also essential to appreciate that the world offers no cost-free option. Alternatives such as offshore balancing, the favorite of the restrainers, neo-isolationism, or the hope that the U.S. can sit back while allies and international institutions assume the tasks of maintaining international security and economic order are an illusion. Thanks for listening. I welcome John's response, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lieber. I want to leave most of the time for our great students to be able to offer their comments and questions. But I'll start with one, and that is, you rightly pointed out that there is the question of capabilities as well as the question of policy and the ideational direction of U.S. foreign policy. And you also point out the importance of selectivity and prudence, a good Hamiltonian quality in foreign policy.
Not accidental.
Right. And so, my question is this. Given China's surging capabilities, given the constraints on U.S. capabilities with surging federal debt and the strains on our military hardware and the costly service that requires, and the many other challenges we face on the capability side, does a deeply engaged U.S. foreign policy require a significant rebalancing? In particular, does it require a much greater relative focus on the Pacific? And what are the implications of that for U.S. policy in the Gulf and the Middle East more broadly?
It's a great question. Are you able to hear me on this? It's a great question. Yes, it does require more emphasis on counterbalancing China in close cooperation with our allies. Some of that is going on already in the nascent cooperation that's emerging involving India, Japan, Australia, and the United States in particular. But other countries need to be brought into it. In Europe, it means that the European members of NATO have to pick up more of the burden. It's been a running sore that they have failed, most of them have failed to meet NATO's 2% threshold. That is, the NATO countries had agreed a decade and a half or so ago that each NATO member country should spend at least 2% of its GNP on defense. And while half a dozen or so NATO countries do that, most don't. They need to take more on themselves to counterbalance Russia in collaboration with the United States. In the Middle East, it's not either or. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, was disastrous. It's true that Afghanistan, the regime was incredibly corrupt. The Afghan army did not have 300,000 well-equipped, well-trained troops. It had a fraction of that number due to corruption. And with local commanders and authorities siphoning off much of the funding for the military. But having a small American presence there, that is to say, to provide things that are America's comparative advantage, the technology, the search and rescue, the advanced weaponry, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and so forth, can pay real dividends. Same thing's true in Iraq and Syria, where relatively small numbers of troops on the order of a couple of thousands can do that. A negative example came in Barack Obama's desire to pull all U.S. troops out of Iraq in 2011. By 2011, ISIS had been defeated. Iraq had had free elections and was seemingly stable. Military commanders wanted the U.S. to leave, and somewhere between 5,000 troops there, plus or minus, largely again for non-combat purposes, but to provide these special capacities and as a signal both to allies and adversaries that the U.S. was there. Instead, all the troops were pulled out. Obama gave a speech in December 2011 heralding the withdrawal, talking about Iraq as a stable democratic ally and so forth. In fact, there was nothing of the kind. As soon as the Americans withdrew, the Prime Minister of Iraq immediately began oppressing the Sunnis, removing capable generals and putting in his own corrupt cronies, and creating the conditions where in 2014 ISIS could intervene, take over about a third of the country, and in effect force the U.S. to re-intervene again with first air power and then troops, making Obama the fourth U.S. president in a row to come into Iraq. So often it's not all or nothing. American presence, skillfully done in more prudent ways, emphasizing what we do best, our value-added or comparative advantage, can pay great dividends. But it doesn't mean you can withdraw completely. You always have to ask yourself, what are the alternatives? It doesn't necessarily tell you how to respond to what Iran is doing today or tomorrow, but it's, I think, a decent rule of thumb.
Thank you. Now I want to turn to the audience and see what questions and comments you have, unless Will wants to start off with one.
Yeah, thank you for the speech that you gave us. It was very entertaining and interesting on my end. I would like to start off with a question of mine, which is on the idea of bandwagoning and buck passing, balancing problems within international relations. For example, Stephen Walt in his book on alliances claimed that bandwagoning is actually very rare. And often realists would point to a lot of actions by, for example, you mentioned the Philippines when they, as an example of bandwagoning with China. How do you think realists could explain why China's neighbors are deciding to bandwagon / buck pass with a rising hegemon? Do you think that is compatible with the defensive realist logic when it comes to international relations? And if so, how do you think that the United States should raise its commitment device? You also mentioned how the U.S. is there as a deterrence, which by having essentially a tripwire defense, how should the U.S. ensure that send a costly signal, as Jerome would like to put it, so that adversarial states don't revise the status quo?
Steve Walt's description, I don't think, is accurate. Let me cite the case of the Philippines as a wonderful case in point. As I think many of you know, China has spent the last half dozen years occupying islands, islets, rocky outcroppings in the South China Sea, often in territorial waters or special economic zones of other countries, expanding them by adding rock and dirt, creating airstrips and militarizing them. And the Philippines complained about it and took the issue to an international court in The Hague. The court, I think in 2016, ruled unanimously in favor of the Philippines. There were 4 or 5 or 6 specific issues, and every single one they voted in favor of the Philippines and against China. China just blew it off totally. And the Philippines, rather than seeking support from others, basically gave up on it because they were confronted by a powerful neighbor showing itself willing to blackmail or squeeze its neighbors militarily, and not being sure about support from the United States or others. In Europe, the presence of NATO prevented that from happening during the Cold War, when it might otherwise have happened. If you look at the rise of the events of the 1930s, with the role of Mussolini's Italy, Nazi Germany, the Japanese military, I think bandwagoning against media leaders is more common. And so it depends what cases you're looking at. But you asked a complex question with a lot of pieces.
Thank you. And I'll add, while you all are thinking of your questions, that there's an assumption in Walt's study that states would like to balance and also have some practical capacity to do so. And I think the latter is often not true, which is one reason why I agree with Professor Lieber that bandwagoning is more common than traditional defensive realist theory would presuppose. One of the things that the United States government has to challenge is to provide a sufficiently credible, sustained, and consistent presence in places like Southeast Asia to encourage countries that would like to balance or incline in that direction to do so.
Well, and exactly that point, Barack Obama came to office wanting the United States to pull back, to retrench, to end its endless wars. And he wanted the United Nations to step up, he wanted the EU to step up, and so forth. And when crises erupted in Ukraine in 2014, in Syria in 2013, his reaction was to call on the international community to step up. But nobody stepped up because the U.S. was not doing anything. There's another example. Ukraine had relinquished its atomic weapons in 2004, I think it was. And in doing, when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, Ukraine had a huge nuclear facility. They had lots of weapons manufacturing plants, and so forth. And in the ensuing years, the U.S. worked with Moscow to get not only Ukraine, but Kazakhstan to hand back the nuclear weapons they had to the Russians. There was a fear about loose nukes. I don't remember the exact year, but it was either there was something called there was a declaration signed by the Budapest Memorandum, signed by the United States, Russia, Ukraine, Britain, France, and China. So all 5 permanent members of the Security Council signed this. Ukraine, it memorialized Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, and also reaffirmed the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So a decade or two later, the Russians essentially invade Ukraine. They seize Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, and then a few months later, they invade southeastern Ukraine, Donbass region, through hybrid warfare. What was the reaction of the other countries who had signed the Budapest Memorandum? Nothing. Crickets. In other words, the international community, the UN, and so forth, did not move to do something. And Obama's response, when tasked with why don't we give or sell the Ukrainians more weapons to counter the Russians, was no. He sent them, they requested defensive weapons, and instead he sent them meals ready to eat and blankets. It was only after the Trump administration came in that they sent them very powerful anti-tank weapons, Javelin missiles, capable of disabling Russian tanks. That's one part of the story, of course, but it says something about the unique role of the United States. It's not that somebody else will step in. Brussels can't do it. The EU can't do it. We need to try to continue to encourage our allies and others to play their role, but the U.S. role is indispensable.
Okay, yes, we have a question here in front.
Given recent history with the American response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Syrian civil war, the Trump presidency, and our withdrawal from Afghanistan, do you think that American diplomatic power is weakening, and where do you see American foreign policy heading in the near future?
Well, American diplomacy and America's international presence has been badly weakened. So 3 presidents in a row now have been pulling back. In retrospect, the Iraq War was a mistake. It didn't look like that at the time to many people, myself included. But the strategic costs of that have exceeded the benefits. Nonetheless, the disorderly nature of the withdrawal from Afghanistan had called into question America's capacity and its competence, which is not helpful. And it left a lot of bruised feelings among allies. Nonetheless, there's no alternative to the United States. And capability, wise leadership, careful selection of choices, working with allies can make a difference. A positive sign would be what the effort to work with the Australians, the British, the Indians, the Japanese, and so forth in East Asia is a real sign. Unfortunately, we've left ourselves and our friends very vulnerable in the Middle East. This is not a call for war, but it is a call to say that even a modest U.S. troop presence in Syria and Iraq, which we have now, ought to remain, not be removed or called into question.
I think I saw another hand.
Yes, we'll let you know.
Noah?
If the U.S. can't, there isn't what the U.S. needs to be, and there is still a need for that kind of role that the U.S., at least at this current moment, isn't, do you think it would make sense at all for the United States and other parties to try to empower other parties to take that place instead?
Well, the U.S., I don't need the microphone. Can you hear me in the back row? Yeah. The U.S. role remains indispensable. What the European members of NATO need to do is increase their defense spending and their capabilities. Germany's free riding is a disgrace. Whether that's changeable remains to be seen. There was a Pew poll, the Pew Foundation does some very good polls of foreign opinion, and they found a few years ago that when asked if, the German public when asked if a fellow member of NATO were invaded by the Russians, would they want Germany to act? The majority said no. Then they were asked if Germany were invaded, do they think the U.S. would come to their aid? They said yes. We talk about free riders. Germany spends only about 1.4 or 1.5% of its GDP on defense, and they get a lot less than that. A lot of the actual capacity of their weaponry and their forces is really pretty weak. They need to change that, as an example. I think what we're doing in Asia is working rather better. I think there's receptivity to the U.S. because of our soft power. Despite everything, countries and people do not see the U.S. as a threat to them. They do see Turkey, Iran, China, Russia as threats, which helps a lot. And it gives the U.S. something that's bankable, so to speak. The problem is converting that into tangible responses, which is not easy.
Anyone else?
Okay, I have a quick question. So I don't think it's going to be probably a little complicated. is the rise of China overrated? As we saw through history, well, now that we see declassified documents from the Soviet Union, it was a backwards third world country pretending to be a superpower that had a lot of influence, admittedly, but the CIA overestimated how fast their economy was growing. It was actually, I think, 2/3 the size we thought it was in 1989. Their conventional power was certainly great, without about it. They were very over specialized, and now we see China, the rise of China, the great dragon. They're showing to the rest of the world that they're very strong. They're an ascendant superpower, but perhaps underneath it might be a paper tiger after all. So
I wouldn't use the phrase paper tiger. Russia was a threat. The Soviet Union was a threat. Its economy was a basket case. It was losing the support of its own public. But drunk and dictatorial and repressive, the Russians had nonetheless defeated Nazi Germany in a titanic, brutal struggle. Their nuclear weapons, their subversion, their conventional forces were a threat to the West and the United States, no doubt about it. They were a formidable adversary, and they finally self-destructed. China is not a paper tiger, but China remains very vulnerable. It's getting old before it gets rich. It's hitting the middle income threshold problem. Its economic growth is tapering off. The consolidation of power under Xi Jinping is reawakening all the problems that dictatorship, a single party, a single leader of the party imposes. If you, in that kind of situation, it discourages feedback to improve your own performance based on your shortcomings. It also has, to China's concern, kindled opposition from China's neighbors, finally. Countries feel threatened and are acting accordingly. So China's own adversarial character has driven others into the arms of the United States and others. But I wouldn't underestimate the challenge. One last point about how we keep track. The panda huggers will often cite GDP based on purchasing power parity and say that China already has a GDP about a third larger than the US. That's misleading because purchasing power parity is meant to measure non-market economies. China is now much more modern, and you need to use current exchange rates. And by that measure, the US remains well ahead of China, with 24% or so of world GDP compared to about 16 for China. And on a per capita basis, much farther ahead than that. But the threat from China is real, can't be waved off, and nobody else can play the role the US does.
When we talk about the Soviets and their collapse in 1991, we often talk about Gorbachev's decision to capitulate rather than suppose that he chose to do the right thing rather than simply throw what he had left and just take everyone down with him. If China really does get a little bit more, gets rich, and if Xi Jinping decides that the future of the country is not going to go where he wants, do you think, like Gorbachev, he would do the right thing, or do you think he'd start a war simply because he has no better option?
It's a terrific question, and nobody knows the answer. The success of China and the success of the Chinese Communist Party is dependent on its economic performance and its ability to reinvigorate China, which had a very bad century, basically the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. But China is reunified, in effect, except for Taiwan. which China hadn't governed since about 1895. On top of it, Chinese economic performance is stalling. So what do you do when your economic performance stalls? You inflame nationalism and xenophobia. And that's what the party and Xi Jinping has been doing over the last decade. It's very dangerous. And a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could certainly unleash unforeseeable dangers. All kinds of scenarios. And I think, to be honest, no one can predict how this will play out, except there are good reasons to think the U.S. needs to be more explicit in its support for Taiwan, in its support for Taiwan to arm itself better to make a Chinese attack on Taiwan more costly to Beijing, and therefore to discourage it. But I don't want to oversimplify it.
I think we're just about at the hour, but I think we've got one more question up there.
So you mentioned earlier regarding the Middle East that
A little louder, please. No, it's on,
Give it a
just
chance.
louder.
so you mentioned earlier regarding the Middle East that the U.S. should keep like a small presence in certain countries to ensure just like the safety and stuff. But at what point do you think that the U.S. should withdraw those troops if at any point?
Every situation is different. But the presence of, the true presence is used for geopolitical reasons. It makes the U.S. a player in things that matter, and matters to our friends and allies. It has to do with the Persian Gulf countries, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia. I think, to be fair, their leadership certainly welcomed the U.S. presence, and there was widespread concern over what the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan involved. And I think the costs of pulling out of Syria and Iraq are greater than the benefits from that. In the case of Afghanistan, we had not had a combat casualty for 18 months before the withdrawal, for instance. So it wasn't as though we were shedding all kinds of blood for that presence. The same thing's true in Iraq and Syria right now, with special forces, special kinds of advanced capabilities that only the U.S. has. If that situation were to change, it would call for a re-examination. But in both cases, I think the argument is better to leave well enough alone for the moment. It gives the U.S. some real advantages in maneuverability that a withdrawal would not have, and a withdrawal would, I think, produce harmful reverberations throughout the region.
Thank you for that. And before I turn to Will to wrap this up, let me just say a few things that those of you in AHS who want to stay involved in addressing these kinds of questions in foreign policy, international affairs, I encourage you to participate in some of the regular events that we host at the Ford School, just to give you a sense of some of the things coming. In December, we're going to have a panel on U.S.-China relations with the American Academy of Diplomacy. In January, we'll have a Midwest Symposium and a simulation on the Korean Peninsula. Later in the winter term, we're going to have a series on the Arab-Israeli dispute. And then early next fall, we're going to have another colloquium on U.S.-Russia relations. So lots of chances for you to get engaged. Very much appreciate Professor Lieber coming here to share his insights with us. Let me turn back to Will to close us out.
Right, yeah, so thank you, Dr. Robert Lieber, as well as Dr. Shashari. Again, thank you guys for coming. This is a wonderful conversation and very good questions all around. So yeah, have a nice evening, and I'll see you after Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Should take Professor Emeritus. Sure. You're what major?
No problem. Some of this was just intrinsic.
It was worse than that.
Do you think that either of you guys could get me, or should I start like trying to figure out what I should do? No, it was like proposed like going after, I guess, it was a guy afterwards with me rather than the other guys had let go.
I need to answer my